So what we know is that at the heart of almost all chronic problems in our organizations, in our teams, in our relationships, at the heart of almost all chronic problems are crucial confrontations we're either not holding or not holding well. There are issues we haven't stepped up and addressed. So we've done this research across many, many different problem areas. Healthcare, for example. We went into healthcare organizations and asked the question, are there chronic problems here? And it turns out there are patient safety problems. We have problems with mistakes and near mistakes, year after year, that kill literally tens of thousands of people in the United States. And we wondered, is there something at the heart of that we're doing that is perpetuating these problems? Turns out there is. It turns out that about 80% of healthcare workers say they work regularly, hold your breath here, they work regularly with people they would describe as incompetent. Do you think that would create problems? We found it does. But that's not the problem. The problem is not that we have people that work with those that they judge as less than competent at times. For example, we worked in an emergency room one time where they said there's a nurse here who is terrible at assessing patients. Now, what do they do in emergency rooms? This kind of this, right? We assess patients, and we try to triage and diagnose and so on. They said, this nurse is terrible at assessment. And I said, well, play that out for me. Tell me how this works out. This nurse said, well, just the other day, I walked through the hospital, and I saw that she was in a treatment room with one of the little children here in the hospital. This was a pediatric hospital. She said, I walked by, and I noticed she was checking him, and later on when I came back, I saw her coming out of the room. And so I stopped her, and I said, how's the little boy doing? This is the first sign of problems. If in your organizations you have people double-checking other people's work, it's a sign that you haven't resolved the real issue. She says, how's the little boy doing? The other nurse says, well, I think he's going to be fine. I'm moving on to the next patient. She said, I walked off to start my next assignment and just had that little nagging doubt, second sign of problems. If you have nagging doubts about people's work, odds are that there's a more chronic issue you haven't addressed. She said, so I went back into the room and I looked for the boy and he wasn't there. She said, I turned around to look and see if he'd wandered off, but then sort of this thought struck me. I looked over the table. He'd fallen over backwards and had gone into cardiac arrest. His heart had stopped. She said, I called for a crash cart. We resuscitated him. The boy was okay, and everything's going to be all right. And I said, so how long has this nurse been working here? She said, about 1.5 years. And then I asked her the crucial question. Here's what we know from our research. We know that if a nurse in a healthcare organization is judged as incompetent, the odds are less than 1 in 8 that anybody is going to speak up and confront that competence problem. Do you think that contributes to errors? Oh, yes. In fact, this is what drives errors in many cases. If the person judged to be incompetent is a doctor, the odds are less than 1 in 100 that anybody is going to step up and have the crucial confrontation with that person. At the heart of almost all chronic problems in organizations are crucial confrontations people have either not held or not held particularly well. Now, we're talking about healthcare, but this carries on to many, many other kinds of organizations, and this is the dynamic. We ask them the question in these healthcare organizations, not just, have you spoken up and dealt with the issue, but how long has this issue gone on? With that nurse it was 1.5 years. Look at the statistics with doctors. I mean, does that trouble you? Look in how many cases the problems will persist for 1 year to 5 years, or 5 years or longer, and how many patients are treated or touched during those intervals. What we're talking about here is the heart of organizational effectiveness, the heart of personal effectiveness. And if you and your organizations do not increase your capacity to confront, discuss, and resolve these kinds of crucial issues, we pay an enormous price year over year over year. So, then we started to ask the question, all right, we know these issues have to be addressed, but how do you do it? How do you do it, and how do you do it well? So we spent over 10,000 hours watching people in the course of crucial confrontations, trying to figure out what they do that makes it either work or not work. Which ones go well and resolve problems, which ones go poorly and end up causing the problems to worsen or persist. What we found is there are a handful of skills that you can use that predictably, repeatedly, and sustainably create positive and effective crucial confrontations. Here's the first. If you can learn to do this one, there's almost nothing you can't discuss. As we watched Crucial Confrontations, we found that you could predict how the crucial confrontation would end by watching just the first 30 seconds. We called these the hazardous half minute. Have you ever been paralyzed with fear during those hazardous half minutes? You ever had that happen to you? You ever just sort of sat there with your mouth opening and closing and not sure what to say? So we put our microscope on those first 30 seconds when the crucial confrontation came out well, and the first thing we found you have to do is this. It's create safety. Your first job during a crucial confrontation, in fact, the job which, if you do it well, will give you a 97, write this number down, 97% probability of a positive outcome. You do this one well, and so much good follows. Your job is to create safety. Let me illustrate what I mean by this. I had studied this for many, many years, but there have been a few instances where it sort of found its way into the marrow of my bones, personal experiences I've had. One of them was a life-threatening situation in an airport in Bangladesh. I'd spent a couple of weeks there on an assignment, and I was exhausted, road-weary, anxious to get back home. And I got to the airport in Dhaka an hour and a half early. I was feeling very, very responsible. And as I walked into the airport, feeling responsible, feeling confident about my prospects for getting home and everything, I noticed the airport was just jam-packed with people. You ever had that happen? And just a mess, a giant mass of humanity. And I started looking around a little bit more panicked, and I found my carrier, and there were only 2 people doing check-ins, and the line was snaking out the door, and I thought, oh my goodness, but I got to the end of the line and started dragging my bag forward a little bit at a time and trying to hurry the process along, and since I had nothing else to do, I thought I would start a time and motion study. So I started calculating every 5 minutes how many people moved, counting the people in line, dividing it by the minutes left, and after about an hour in the line, my spirits started to lift. I started thinking, I may actually make it. I may actually get there. Well, as I was feeling a little bit more confident, a woman comes into the airport pushing a big, giant, disorganized cart covered with luggage and shoves her way in line just a few people up in front of me. I looked at her and kind of thought, that's kind of annoying, and she's probably going to take a lot of extra time because she's got to reorganize all of her junk there. And I was feeling a little resentful about this when the guy that she cut in line right in front of just explodes. He just goes ballistic. He screams at the back of her head, "Get out of line!" She turns and looks at him and she says, "No, I'm not going to get out of line." And now he says, "You get out of line right now!" She says, "Look, I've got to make my flight. My children are going to be waiting for me in San Francisco. There's not another flight I could get on for another 3 days. Please just cut me some slack and let me stay here in line." To which he said, "If you want to get in line, you get in line like the rest of us. You go back to the end of the line." She said, "I am not getting out of line," and turned back around. Now he yells again at the back of her head, "You get out of line or I'm pushing you out of line." Now she turns, looks him full in the face, and says, "You will not." He steps out of line, and he starts to push her luggage cart out of the way. So she goes to the other side of the luggage cart and starts to push it back in. He starts to push, she starts to push, and pretty soon it's getting pretty energetic, and I'm standing back here watching this whole thing escalate thinking, oh my goodness, when all of a sudden he pulls his leg out of the way so her luggage cart slides down. She starts to trip downward. He lifts his hand up and starts to swing it down to slap her on the way down onto the ground. Now again, I'm just a few feet away from this commotion, and I looked at my watch, and I thought to myself, I got nothing better to do. I think I'll get involved. It actually wasn't a conscious process. It was just sort of a reflex. I rushed forward and positioned myself right between him and her. Is this a good idea? This is not a good idea, but I didn't know what else to do, and I didn't want her to get hit, and so I'm standing here, and this man, at first, is sort of caught off guard. He steps back a couple of steps, and he looks a little bit confused, and I thought I had the element of surprise going for me, but he very quickly recovered. He lifts up both his hands. His eyes bug out of his head. His face turns purple. Is this a crucial confrontation? Yes. So here's my question to you. You're the nurse in this emergency room and have what you believe to be an incompetent colleague. How do you start that crucial confrontation, right? You've got a colleague who continually lets you down. You have a spouse or loved one who's behaving in ways that are creating problems in your family. How do you start that crucial confrontation? Well, let me tell you how you don't start it. My temptation in this situation is to start by diving into the issue. My temptation is to start by telling my complaint. That's how we want to begin. You screwed it up with that little boy. You almost killed him. That's how we want to begin. My temptation right now might be to say, back off, buddy. You're not going to hit her. Just slow down. Take a breath here. What I want to start doing is describing my complaint or concern. Wrong place to begin. We know from our research that if you do that, the odds of the crucial confrontation going well drop precipitously. So what do you have to do? Well, first, the promise. Here's what we know. What we know from 10,000 hours of observation is something very, very remarkable, something counterintuitive. What we know is that the riskiness of the issue that you have to address does not predict your success or failure. Think about that for a moment. Most of us labor under the misconception that if something is just too hard to talk about, if something is just too difficult to discuss, that the conversation just can't go well. We think the size of the issue, that the difficulty of the topic itself is the predictor of success or failure. We know from our research that just isn't true. How many of you in your personal lives with a loved one or spouse have found yourself arguing over the stupidest, most trivial little issue before? Has that ever happened to you? Raise your hand if you're with me. How the toilet paper hangs. We blow up here. Whether we should break a $1 bill or not. It doesn't matter. Which restaurant we had to go to. Some trivial little thing can amplify into some huge conflagration. The size of the issue does not predict your success or failure. What predicts your success or failure is your capacity to create safety, period. How do you do that? There are two things you have to do in those first 30 seconds. And if you learn to do these, there's almost nothing you can't discuss. Your first responsibility is to create what we call mutual purpose. It's to help the other person know. Now, please don't miss this. This isn't a trick. This isn't a technique. This isn't a gimmick. Your first responsibility during that crucial confrontation is to help the other person know in their guts that you care about their problems. That's your job. And if you do that well, I'll tell you what you'll see. If you do that really well, you'll watch them physically do this. They'll go, and then you start telling them the truth about your concerns. And they'll be able to hear you. They may not like what you're saying. They may not agree with what you're saying. But they'll be able to hear you. Your second responsibility is to help make sure not just that they know that you care about their problems, but that you care about them. When they know those two things, their defenses drop and they start to hear you. When they don't believe that, the defenses go up and it doesn't matter what you have to say. They won't hear it. They won't hear it. So I'm standing here. And his fists are up, and his eyes are bugging out of his head, and his face is turning purple. And the first thing I said to him was, that was unfair for her to cut in line in front of you. He looked a little confused. I said, you've been standing here in line for over an hour, and she comes and cuts in line. It puts your flight at risk. I said, that's unfair. And his hands dropped down. I said, she cut in line in front of me too, and that's not working for me either. His face turns back to a normal color. I said, I could get somebody from the airport over here. We can try to figure out how to solve the problem. I think we can make this work. His eyes go back into his head. Now, what just happened? Yeah. Now, did I take him off the hook for his misbehavior? No, I didn't. I'm about to put him on the hook. But I can't put him on the hook until he can hear me. I can't hold him accountable for what he's done until he feels safe enough to hear me describe what he's done that isn't working. Does that make sense? Does that make sense? So now he can hear me. And that's when I said, and this was life-changing for me, that's when I said, and sir, I can't go ask for help until I have your word that you're not going to hit her. You had your hand up, you were swinging down on her, and I said, and that's just wrong. You don't get to do that. Now, I don't know that the way I said that was the right way to say that, but what I want you to hear was his response. He went like this. He said, I'm sorry. He said, I'm sorry. It's been an awful week. He said, it's just been horrible. I've got to get home. He said, this is not me. He said, and then he didn't even want to look at me. He tried to look past me to this woman over here, and he says, ma'am, please forgive me. He said, I wouldn't have done anything. He said, I just, this is not me. Now, here's my question to you. How safe would you have to feel to be able to publicly admit that you were an idiot? How safe would you have to feel? How safe would you have to feel to be able to hear from somebody that you were incompetent in your job? How safe would you have to feel to be able to hear from somebody that some of your behavior was inappropriate or ineffective? The predictor of your success or failure in a crucial confrontation is not how risky the issue is, it's your capacity to create safety.